Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson.
And my friend, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known. Hello, Curt Thompson, MD. How are you, my friend?
Pat, man, it's. I mean, even though this is just 1 week after people have heard us.
Yes, we have
it's
not
been a while since we've recorded.
Right.
And man, is it great to be back together.
Yeah, the recordings sometimes have to be spaced out as we're both doing things, and so yeah, it's been longer than a week since we've seen each other, and
it has been.
It's great.
Too
to be
long,
back
man.
with you. For sure.
Right on.
For
right
sure.
on. Exactly. I can't. I don't know if we feel the same way about Amy, but it's.
Of course we do. Of course we do.
At least that's what we want our listeners to believe.
Yes.
Okay. Look, we have not been together. It's been so long. Like, we are like stored up with things.
Exactly.
To say.
Exactly. And when she's not on the microphone to say them for herself.
She's not on the microphone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, man.
So
it's good to be back
we are
together.
here on the Being Known podcast, and we are, in case you've not been following along, we are going through Dr. Curt Thompson's latest book, The Deepest Place, Suffering and the Formation of Hope. And we are this week, we are in chapter 6 of the book, which is entitled Perseverance. And Curt, one of the things that I just want to say off the start of this episode is I'm grateful to you for this chapter. And one of the things that I'm grateful to you for this chapter is I felt like just your openness about sharing your own story in this chapter. I found beautiful, very compelling. I remember as I was reading it, I thought, there's a certain amount of bravery, I think, that goes along with sharing your story in such a way that's so open and honest. And also, you're putting it in a book. It's not you and I sitting somewhere at a table. And so I know that there's a little bit of, I don't want to over dramatize or anything, but I know there's a little bit of sacrifice that comes from, putting certain parts of your story out there that aren't the easiest parts of your story. But I want you to know that me as a listener or as a reader, and I think that I think that I speak for a lot of your readers, we're grateful that you've gone there and that you've put yourself out there in a way that we can see ourselves in your story. And it helps us to understand, I think, it helps me to understand the material better. And when you're so willing to share your story, it makes me want to keep reading. And so just wanted to say thank you for that.
Well, thanks. I thank you. I'm just taking that in, and I'll say now also to our listeners that my comment just a moment ago about Amy, I'm feeling a little I'm feeling things about that because I want to say. I'm aware that I'm able to make that comment about Amy because I love her so much, right. And that comment is a bid for connection, and it's a bid for connection with someone who I know cares about me, and I know that you care about me. And in the course of, I wrote this book in the time frame that we have been recording this podcast, and. Our friendships, the three of us, are friendships that have enabled me to name, some of the friendships, some of the really important friendships, including some others that I have. But the two of you are friendships that have enabled me to name the things that I wrote about in the book. In such a way that I was able to write about them in the book. Mm-hmm. And so, as we're going to talk about here regarding perseverance, I'm grateful for your words, and your words are a reflection of the relationship that you and Amy and I have together.
Yeah.
And that I know that you have with others, and that Amy has with others,
Right.
And that I have with others, and recognizing that perseverance is not something that I do by myself. We do it most effectively because we do it in community, and so anyway, thanks for your words, and I do trust. I hope that the readers and our listeners find it to be helpful, because we all have these parts that we work really hard to keep out of the daylight.
Right.
And so
yeah. So perseverance. Let's jump in.
yeah. So I mean, one thing, this comes from this particular part of this phrase of the third verse of Romans 5, where Paul has just talked about suffering, and then he jumps to this notion that suffering leads to perseverance. Suffering produces perseverance. And I think the first thing I want to say is that I don't really feel like persevering. Like persevering, like it sounds sexy, like it sounds like the kind of thing that you want, but it's like, I like the idea of what it produces. I just don't want to have to do what I have to do to get there. You're right. It's just
you don't want to have to persevere in order to experience perseverance.
No. I want to be able to look back and say, man, I really persevered somehow magically without having done it.
Right. It will be great to have done it. I feel that way about a lot of things. Oh, it's so good to have done that.
Dude, yes. I'm so glad to have had the root canal now 6 weeks later and persevered through all that's required. But I mean, I think, we read, for those of us who are Jesus followers and who might be familiar with this text, we read this text and we're so familiar with it that sometimes we may not be distanced enough from it to stop and say, like, well, wait a minute, because Paul writes this and says, like, we know that suffering produces perseverance. And I'm like, I know a lot of situations where it does not produce perseverance. It produces all kinds of other things for me. It produces a tendency toward addiction. It produces me being irritable. Suffering produces, like, perseverance is not it.
Yeah.
And then there's the other thing is, like, okay, how is he getting there? How's he making that jump? How do any of us move toward perseverance? Now, the thing is, in his time, I mean, he wasn't the only person who thought that perseverance as a virtue was an important thing. I mean, the Greek Stoics, the Spartans, right? All of the whole notion that we are going to have a posture toward life in which we're not really going to pay that much attention to the highs and lows. We're just going to keep moving one day at a time. Because the real question is, how do I respond to this? And of course, again, too, like, that's a nice idea. But you don't really see a lot of stoicism being, like, 2 thumbs up on Facebook these days or on Instagram. Right. It's like, I love being stoic. No, you don't love being stoic because you're not allowed to love things. You're just there. And so he was aware there were others in his world who knew what perseverance was. But there's something about Paul's experience with Jesus that is suggesting that this is something beyond just stoicism. Something beyond just like, I'm just going to white knuckle this and keep moving. And he's not assuming, even though he says that suffering produces it, he's not assuming that perseverance happens as a matter of course. He's making that jump first and foremost because he's talking about a king. He's talking about Jesus, who himself, from the time he's conceived, has known a life of perseverance. Like the whole notion that when Jesus is conceived by a virgin in a backwater town, right? So what is it like for Mary and Joseph to persevere in the face of all of that social, whatever was going on, to find out that you're pregnant but you're not married?
Right.
And then, and then he's born, and then Herod's whole thing about the death of the infants. And so they flee to Egypt, And then they come back. But when they come back, they go to Nazareth because they're still worried about things. There's lots of perseverance that his family is engaged in long before he becomes an adult. And then the whole notion of him persevering in his family, even as a 12-year-old, he's in the temple. And mom and dad are like, where the heck have you been? And he's like, well, he's having to learn how to be in his system and persevere. And then, it's right up through then to his baptism. He goes from his baptism into the wilderness. And beyond, he's going to have to persevere even though Satan will continue to nip at his heels up to and even through the crucifixion. Because one of the overarching themes that we see in the Gospels is Jesus' deep sense and conviction that he's not by himself, ever. That his Father and the Spirit are with him. His perseverance isn't just a thing that he does, that he commits to on its own. He's doing this in the presence and company of his Father and the Spirit. You get to the end of John 10, where he asks his small inner circle of disciples. This is after feeding 5,000, and then people left, and then more people left, and more people left, and more people left, as Jesus kind of upped the ante for what it was going to mean to follow him. And then he turns to them and says, will you also lead me? Because he's much like us. He's having to contend with this real human sense that I feel like I'm alone in the world. And so what does it mean? How do we do this? But he's continuing to persevere because he's not alone. But he is continuing to be mindful of the love of his Father. And then you get to Paul himself, recognizing that even though he's writing about perseverance, that perseverance for him was being nurtured in the context of a community. He has this thing that happens on the Damascus Road, and then he, sent to this house of this dude named Ananias. And if you're Ananias, you're like, what the heck? It's like when your worst enemy is now coming, the one who's been trying to kill you and everybody like you is now saying like, hey, this guy wants to come and like, we're bringing him to your house. Like, what the heck? But Paul begins his community. But if you're Paul and you can't see, and you're being taken to a home of someone who's part of a community that you've been trying to kill, if I'm Paul, I'm thinking like, they're going to take me there, they're going to kill me. Because Paul doesn't really know much about the Jesus way yet. So he's having to practice living this new life in community. And then Barnabas comes alongside him, supports him, and then he introduces him to the disciples. And there's no place that Paul goes in any of his letters where he's not traveling with companions. And this sense, then, of perseverance necessarily is formed in a context of community. But it's not easy for us to do this, and not all of us have had the kind of community that we wish we had. In the book, I tell a little bit about my own story, to which you were alluding earlier. And without going into a lot of detail, it was just, I mentioned in the book, there's this word of this arc of unwantability. And, my parents were in their mid-40s when I was born. Their pregnancy with me was not one they were wanting to have. I mean, we all kind of say this, smiling and so forth and so on.
Because how many years were between you and your brother?
My brothers at the time were 18, 16, and 11 years old. And my parents were, as the story was told to me, like they were done. There was no, I don't even know if they thought they could get pregnant at that point. And so, many of our listeners, if you imagine, if you think you're done with your family and then you're 44 years old and you discover that you're pregnant, it's like this is just not, I have this photo of my parents together on a couch the night before I was born. And dude, like, this is not a picture of the happy couple. You'd think that they just lost a kid, right? If you were to look, because they're anxious, they're worried, their world's about to get kind of disrupted in a way that they weren't planning on. And the reality is, this is no fault of theirs, but the reality is that I was not a source of joy. My presence was a source of anxiety.
Yeah.
And it just went, you combine that with some of my own temperament, and then, growing up in a world in which my parents, I'm in church 3 times a week. I didn't know anybody else my age who, for whom this was true. Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening prayer meeting, right? There's this felt sense, like, I think I've told this story before, right? This sense of, I'm 10 years old, we're playing football in the front yard.
Yeah.
Summer night, my mom walks out, are you going to go to prayer meeting with me? I'm thinking, like, even as a 10-year-old, I'm aware, like, this doesn't really sound like the right question to be asking me, let alone asking me in front of my friends.
Right.
And I say, do I have to? And she says, well, where do you think Jesus would want you to be? And I didn't have the courage at the time to say, I think he wants me here playing football.
Yeah.
So this felt sense of kind of being an outsider. And not because somebody came up and said to me, you're an outsider. In fact, I was well liked, and at least it would appear on the surface, but there's always a part of me, I don't know, I'm not alone with this, right? There are a lot of us that function in the world, and if we were to just look at the data on paper, we would say, I think these people like me, but then we'd have other voices that would be saying, yeah, but do they really? Or the voice that says, they don't really like you, because if they did, you'd be included in all kinds of things that they don't include you in, which would then became the case when I was in high school. And then in addition to this...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to say, imagine the kid, I don't want to take us off track, but imagine the kids today who are feeling that, and then they open up social media, and then they see what everybody's doing without them, and they see what everybody's put. Yeah, it just is, painful.
Yeah. And so then, you find that you're having to contend with all these stories that start to flood your head. Mm-hmm. And you have to persevere through that. Now, the temptation would be to say, well, Curt, look, your story, we could name very quickly 10, 100, 1,000 people's stories who are far worse than yours. That would be the temptation. But God's not going to ask me about those stories at the judgment. God's going to ask me what I've done with mine. And to our listeners, I would say the same thing, right? God's not going to ask you, for those of us who are tempted to dismiss our story.
Exactly.
God's not going to ask you about other people. God's going to have a conversation with us about us. And, and then I meet Jesus when I'm 13 in a very powerful way, but then almost immediately after that, have this existential crisis that lasts for about 20 years. So there was, it felt like to be in my head was a slog. And, you're not, and some of what was so painful about it, I wouldn't, in that case, it's not so much about persevering in the way Paul's talking about. I'm just trying to get through my day. But the whole time, the running theme is that there's something not enough about me, such that I'm unwantable. Not so much that someone else doesn't want me, but that I'm not wantable in and of myself. There's something about me that's inherently significant about this. And I would say that, we all have different versions of this same thing. And one of the things that then makes perseverance difficult because of this is because we practice. There's a lot, as I like to say, there's a lot of neural real estate that is taken up by the things that have happened to us, the things that we've done to ourselves. We talked about this in the last chapter about how suffering has a lot to do with what I do to myself. And a lot of what was going on here was throughout my early years, my first 2 decades, it's what I'm doing to myself. And that real estate that is taken up by my memory and rehashing of my trauma and my shame, and about my unfinished business. But we see this in biblical characters like Moses. He goes to his death with an anger problem. He still has an anger problem. David, right? His tryst and the whole thing with Bathsheba and all that didn't just happen in a vacuum. I mean, he had his own stuff, his own unfinished business. And so there's all of this neural real estate wrapped up in shame and trauma, but it's also that it's happening in the privacy of my own mind. That's the other thing. Nobody knows about this stuff. Because it's too embarrassing to tell people that I'm having these thoughts. Right? I mean, I remember I got into just after high school, I graduated, and I came to find out that I had, there were some friends of mine who had been engaged in doing some things in which, I had just not been included.
Yeah. And
of course, what I said, well, that's okay. It wasn't okay, but I'm gonna talk about it as if it is, because I've got this unfinished business that I don't really want to contend with. Didn't know to contend with, and so. We had a character in the previous chapter for those of us for our readers, listeners who were reading the book, this Wendy, who said, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep persevering. And then, we turn, in the biblical narrative, we see there are a couple of characters. Judas gets, in some respects, at times I think gets more of a bad rap than he deserves. But there's not much difference between Judas and Peter. They both betrayed our Lord, just like I do. It's just that Peter, for whatever reason, decided to continue to persevere. And the difference is that Peter, and when we read in Luke's gospel, in Matthew's gospel as well, but that when it dawned on Peter, the cock crows and he's been revealed to have denied Jesus, he went out and wept bitterly. And one of the things that we want to say that's part of perseverance, part of the hard work, includes the role of lament. If I'm going to persevere, there are going to be plenty of moments in which I'm not going to want to persevere. There are going to be plenty of moments in which, like Wendy, I'm going to want to say, I can't keep doing this. There are going to be plenty of moments in which my old story will want to circle back around and try to tangle me up in itself. And I'll feel like throwing in the towel. And it's then that, you and Amy and I are on the call. And we name these things. And I don't feel alone. And that includes naming our grief, the things that give us great sadness, but also our anger about things that we've done, things that we've been done to us, in order for us to be moved along by our community in such a way that that lamenting process enables me to continue to do the work, continue to persevere. And in this way, suffering drives me to relationship with our friendship, for example, and the friendships that you and Amy have and that I have with other people who are significant to us, drives us to that connection that enables us in our grief to know we're not alone. And so be strengthened to continue to put the next foot forward in this. And this way we would say that growth is less about just making progress. It's more about becoming more comfortable being in this deepest place of suffering because we're not there by ourselves. We like to say the brain can do a lot of hard things for a long time as long as it doesn't have to do it by itself. Perseverance.
This is just, makes me think of this. So this morning, this is the I hope I don't derail us. This morning, I'm on the treadmill at Orange Theory class,
Yeah.
and I don't know what the class is. I never look to see what the class is going to be, and this morning was a 24-minute endurance run, and so you get the you're basically on your own, but you set your treadmill at a speed that you think you can hold for 24 minutes, and I set the bar pretty high for myself, and I wanted to quit so many times in that 24 minutes, especially the last 10. I wanted to quit. But the people next to me weren't quitting. As a matter of
Right.
fact, as a matter of fact, we were kind of encouraging each other on. And the
Right.
coach was coming and he was acknowledging what we were doing, and he's saying, "You got this, you got this." And it was a thing where, I really don't necessarily, my body doesn't really want to do this right
No,
now.
I don't want to persevere.
I want to bring that speed down to the very lowest and walk for a while, but I'm just going to keep doing it. I'm going to keep doing it. And that perseverance, it hurt. I mean,
Right.
I was hurting by the end of that thing, but I've never been, and I'll say this, in the past, I have just belonged to gyms. Go to a gym by myself. I'll get on a treadmill. I would never do a 24-minute endurance run like I did today.
Right.
There's no way.
Right.
Because I'm in a
Right.
community of people. We're doing it together, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. That's a beautiful example of the very thing that we're talking about. In interpersonal neurobiology terms, we like to talk about snagging the brain. We're taking advantage of the brain's neuroplastic flexibility. And to snag it's an acronym to SNAG, to stimulate neuronal activation and growth. We've talked about this in other seasons. And that, our patient Wendy that we were mentioning earlier, this whole notion that when she has an experience in the confessional community, for example, this role and place of it being like it's our Orange Theory community, right? In which, as Wendy would name her experience, and people would capture her attention and be empathic, but then also name for her what they long for her to become. She would have a moment, and then we would want to have her revisit this and have her practice this attentional direction. So we would give her the assignment of doing this later in the day, doing this every day for the next 7 days, going back and remembering and journaling and writing out the screenplay of what just happened, so that she's recalling her experience in the comfort of this group, yet in the presence of the shame that she has brought into the room, such that shame is transformed by the presence of others who are with her. That longing to say, like, I'm not enough for this, and you see the runner next to you.
Yeah.
And the runner next to you is saying, even without words, because they're too busy breathing,
Right.
we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep doing this. This process, this is the other thing. Perseverance takes a long time. Like, by definition, okay, I'll persevere. Okay, I'll do that. What's this going to like 3 or 4 minutes? Is that we're going to do 3 or 4 minutes?
Right.
No, it is a lifetime, and it requires more than just insight, right? It takes more than just someone pointing something out to me. People couldn't just point something out to Wendy or point something out to me. I had to have the felt sense that I'm understood. In order for me then to take the next step in a new direction. And this is where we say that Jesus is looking for serious followers. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and we were talking about people who really have to contend with the shame of traumatic events and addictions that have to do with sexuality. And how I would like to just be over my addiction. I would just like to, could you please give me the thing to do such that I won't want to engage in this addictive behavior anymore, whether it's pornography or masturbation, or men and women, right? And the thing is, God takes us so seriously that he wants us to participate in, first of all, being people of restraint. So we have to restrain addictions. This is hard to do. There's no magic bullet for this. There's no magic word. There's no magic drug. There's no magic any of this. It is my willingness to choose not to take the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I have to refrain from that. It's hard because God is saying, I want real partners in the world. I'm not going to continue to parent you like you're a newborn who I have to tote around everywhere. I want you to grow up into adulthood. So this is challenging because he wants serious followers. So living in the real world, in the world that we actually occupy, requires perseverance in the face of messaging from the world that suggests we shouldn't have to do that. We should be able to have what we want, how we want it, when we want it, without delaying gratification. You do you. This is AT&T's ad. You do you. Whatever you need, whatever you want, whatever you deem to be what is real in the world, that's the way it is. And you shouldn't have to persevere to do much of anything else to get what you need. But what we find, and this is the irony, it's the upside down world of the kingdom, is that when we are willing to persevere in the presence of community that is continually with us on this journey, when we are willing to persevere, we discover over time, which we're going to get to in our next episode, we discover over time that we are becoming something different than who we were. And as we'll also talk about in the next episode, it's often the case that we are not the first to recognize that. Like you go to Orange Theory and, you would be able to say, because you're thoughtful and you're aware and you're honest, and you would say, yeah, I'm in better shape now than I was 4 years ago. I'm in better shape, you might say that. But the very act of being on the treadmill, doing the 24-minute continual run, what does it tell you? It just reminds you that I feel like I'm out of shape.
Right.
Because we keep, and so how immediately when you're done, so how are you doing? I'm not doing that ever again. Right? The whole sense, I don't feel like I'm in shape, but somebody else who's the coach, our friends, the people who've been next to us and who've watched us. We have this. I'll just say this. We have a number of situations recently that we've just named in a number of our confessional communities where there are participants who, over the course of anywhere from 2 to 4 to 5 years, are just they are simply not the same people who walked in the door. But when you ask them, they're like Wendy. I can't keep doing this. To which we say, well, that's interesting because you have been doing it, even to the point where we barely recognize you.
Right.
So I don't know who the you is you're talking about that can't do the things you're doing.
Right.
And so this is, again, because that payload of shame will continually want us to be thinking that we still haven't made the benchmark.
Yeah, and one of the things that you say is, we oftentimes need others to imagine things for us before we can imagine them for ourselves. So outside of that community, she doesn't have people that are imagining that she can do this, and also reflect on what they see that she has done.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love your story of, there was a time when I went to a gym.
Yeah. Yeah, there were no the gains are of physical health have been extraordinarily better doing it with a group for me.
Yeah,
and in a community actually where I'm meeting people. I'm with these same people every morning pretty much. Some people switch out, but
yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah,
and we encourage each other, and it's been great.
That's beautiful. So again, we're getting us ready to enter into this next episode on character, but just as an encouragement for our listeners that with perseverance, we want to say that the God, that the God of the Bible, that the Jesus of history, that the Spirit who is on the face of the earth and on the move and changing us, this holy triune God wants us to know that with perseverance, the Trinity is turning us into people that we might not recognize, but that others see as being different. And this is the other thing. There is no other way to go about it. It's not like, well, there are certain people who have to persevere because like their life is just like harder than mine. If we're going to become professional human beings, if we're going to practice for heaven, if we were going to become these icons of beauty, perseverance will be a necessary thing. And so the question is, how can we, in the context of a vulnerable community, enable, through the power of the Spirit, enable ourselves to do this very thing that we have to do?
Yeah. Thank you, Curt. I think that brings us to our application for the week. So your application for this week is to make a list of those areas of your life in which you sense needing to persevere. And which of these items have you feeling overwhelmed and not wanting to persevere? So consider sharing with someone that you trust about these areas and begin to practice monitoring how you sense your life changing when you allow others to join you in your work of perseverance. Excellent. Curt, thank you for today. As usual, it was great.
Pep, it's been great.
Spending time with you.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah.
Right on.
For those of you who are watching on YouTube, stick around because Amy Chella is joining us. All right, bud. Love you.
All right, man. Yep, you too.
Hi, guys.
Hey,
There
Amy.
she is.
Oh, my gosh.
Oh, my gosh.
Okay, I want to, well, first I want to remind all of our people, like, if you don't have the book, get it. Because, like, one of the things I want to talk about, we didn't cover, or you guys didn't cover in the episode, because there's so much. And so, if you don't have the book, go get it. So the part, Curt, where, so the brain can do a lot of hard things for a long time as long as it doesn't have to do it by itself. Mm-hmm. And then Pep, when you talked about Orange Theory and going to the gym versus being in the same room with a bunch of people that are on the same mission.
Yeah.
It was like, we can do it if we're in it together. And so, like, Curt, you talk about our coping skills. Like, so when we're faced with a situation to persevere, where we can persevere, we oftentimes go to our coping mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And then I think we've talked about shame. So if we start to think about our coping mechanisms, you going to say something, Curt?
No.
Oh. If we go to our
eventually.
I'm hoping. If we go to our coping mechanisms, we can be flooded. I can be flooded with shame and be like, look at me trying to do this. This is hardly persevering.
Right.
But if we can be curious, then, like, Curt, you just naming the idea that we go to coping mechanisms, it's like, oh, look at that. That is my go-to.
Yeah.
And then we rob ourselves of this lamenting. It's not ignoring our grief and ignoring our anger. It's we get to lament. It is part of it.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. 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 I mean, I'm just aware of this. This thing about grief really has struck me. As part of perseverance, because, Pep, the Orange Theory example, is we're going to get a lot of mileage out of that, no pun intended. But, endurance athletes talk a lot about suffering. Mm-hmm. And it's something about them, something within them has them wanting to persevere. And, I think about, there was a time in my life where I was, riding a road bike for quite a bit. And so interested in the different tours that are going everywhere. And these tours are all made up of teams. These, you've got multiple different teams, and each of those teams have, they might have a particular rider, a particular cyclist who's their number one cyclist, but the team is doing what they can to help propel the cyclist forward. But so often you're like, well, gosh, the cyclist is just like they're just having to do the thing, and like you come to discover, well, actually, no, the cyclist, their lead, the lead cyclist in whatever team might be in the race. That cyclist is depending heavily on the presence of others who are with him, and not just to draft and all those kinds of things, but it's the very awareness of presence that enables them to persevere in a particular direction. And that's the other thing. It's like you could have people standing around in the gym. You could have people next to you who are doing all kinds of other exercises.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But you have someone who's doing the same exercise, moving in the same direction. And you can both see that like you're suffering.
Yeah, and what's interesting, the part of that too is, I could be next to someone who we have the same time goal, but we're pushing at our own, we're pushing ourselves to our own limit, right? It's not like the person next to me is doing the same speeds and everything that I'm doing, but we're encouraging one another to do our very best at, at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I really appreciate that, Amy. This notion of continuing to know that we are tethered and connected to others. And it's funny. I find this to be true in a number of different domains of my life, like persevering in the work that I do, persevering here in the work that we do here with this podcast. Mm-hmm. I think persevering in marriage, and I persevere in my marriage not just because I'm connected to Phyllis, to whom I'm deeply connected, but also because as a couple, we're deeply connected to other couples who are also persevering, who know that marriage requires work. It's a beautiful thing, and it requires effort. And I'm, as we each are, we're tethered to other people, like in my work area. All right, I talk about the joy that has been mine in the last 4 years since I've transferred ownership, and what a joy it has been to work with my colleague Courtney, who's now the owner, and the role that has played. But it has required me to figure out where do I belong? Where do I fit in now that I don't own the practice, and all those kinds of things. And she has been so gracious in our ongoing conversation about the role that I play, so that I'm not, I continue to feel tethered. I feel tethered to her, I feel tethered to the other people in the practice, as a way to continue to persevere while I'm trying to figure out my role as evolving and emerging in this practice that I continue to love being part of. And so we have all kinds of, and then to persevere in the face of things that are happening in our lives that we wish weren't happening.
Right.
Right. I mean, we've all three named to each other. We've named experiences that have happened within the last number of months that are unpleasant, and that and that involve people, real people that we're having to, like, how do I respond? Like, something's happened, and I have all these feelings that are hard and unpleasant, and I've been hurt. I'm angry. I'm this. I'm that. I'm all these. And how do I persevere as the person that I want to become? I can't do this without having a place to come and name these things. And this is one space for me with the two of you to come and say, this happened to me. Mm-hmm. And we process this. It happens on Tuesday mornings for me with the guys that I'm with. It happens, of course, with my wife but there is a sense in which evil's capacity to want to have me get off the treadmill,
right,
to stop persevering. It is like barking in my ear almost with every step. And especially, as you said, Pepper, the last 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love the application of just naming areas that we have the opportunity to persevere.
Yeah. What about that? What about that?
Well, because
is helpful?
it's like a baby step, because it's just acknowledging that there are areas that are hard for us.
Yeah.
And so it's not even like, okay, name them, persevere, do all the things. It's like, oh, yeah, I do have areas. Because we can go through our day thinking we're aware of it. Our bodies are aware of it. But it just, the simplicity of just naming them.
Right. Well, and I know there's a part of me that feels embarrassed. That feels slightly embarrassed or ashamed that there is an area that within which I have to persevere. Like, because it reveals I don't want to do this. This is hard for me to do. It's an area where I don't have all my ducks lined up in a row. It reveals my, how long I yet have to go. All of that, I can hear, that unclean spirit talking to me and just pointing like, gosh, you really do not have your stuff together, do you? And that's what everybody's thinking. That's what everybody's aware of. So, just the very fact that you persevere, like we were saying earlier, Pat, like the very fact that I'm staying on the treadmill for this long only like reminds me of how hard it is for me to be on the treadmill.
Right.
And it's in those moments where it's helpful to bring you two to mind, to bring the people in our lives, in the confessional communities. We hear this all the time, that the whole notion of like I was in this place that was really difficult, and I saw each of you in the room where you were standing,
you were
coming for me. Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
Grateful to be doing it with you guys.
Indeed.
Right on.
Indeed.
Right on.
It's a great morning.
It is.
Yeah.
We should do it
Good
more
to be with
often.
you. We should do it more often. All right,
next
then.
week.
All right.
Next week.
I love you guys.
Right. Love you guys.
See you soon. Love you.
This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at BeingKnownPod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.